In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about distribution visualization in Tableau. So, as you know from the reading, distribution visualization helps to provide the viewer with some information about the data and the data characteristics that you can't see from certain statistical data. Sure, you can read what the skewness is, and you can read what the mode is and things like that, but those kinds of statistics are far better understood visually. So what we're going to do in this hands-on is we're going to use the coffee chain sample data, and we're going to do just a few different distribution ideas. Basically, we're going to look at the kind of the standard distribution graphic, which is the histogram, and we're going to also look at some box and whisker charts. All right. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go over here to the Show Me tab, and we're going to look for a histogram. What do we need? All we need is one measure, and by choosing one measure, we can then slice and dice it with dimensions any way we want. And so what we are really interested in this video is to understand the distribution of sales. So why don't we go ahead and grab sales, and we'll throw it here into columns. It doesn't really matter where we put it. We could have put it in rows just as easily. And I'm going to hit histogram, and all of a sudden I have a histogram. And isn't that awesome? Right? However, note now that I don't have the sales pill up here anymore. I'm going to hit undo. We went from here where we have sum of sales, and I'm going to hit redo, and now we have two new things. We have something called sales bin in the columns, and we have something called count of sales in the rows. And I'm going to hit undo again, and watch over here in the dimensions area. When I hit redo, a new field appears, the sales bin field. It is a different field from the sales field. All right. Now we could leave it at this and just say, hey, we're done with our histogram. We did what we were asked to do, and here it is. However, when we look at this distribution, we see something that's kind of interesting. We see here that there's one kind of shape here that looks kind of like a curve, and then there's this new bump over here. And I don't know if you remember this from your statistics classes, but when you see kind of two hills, there may be something else going on in the data. But before we get into that, I want to show you that you very easily could have created this exact same histogram without needing to use the Show Me tab. All we would have had to do was create this bin field, and we could have made it ourselves. So let's take a look at how we would do this. I'm going to make a new sheet, and instead of using this sales bin field, I'm going to right-click on sales, click the drop down here, and I'm going to choose to create bins. Now, I'm going to create this, instead of calling it sales bin 2, I'm going to call it my sales bin. And if you hit suggest bin size, it's going to look at the distribution of the data, and it's going to suggest a bin size that is statistically the most fitting. We won't really get into how that algorithm works right now. But in most cases, most business people aren't going to be interested in bins that are $34.30, right? We're going to want to make these bin sizes more standard. So let's make our size of bin 50 and hit OK. Now that we've created our My Sales bin, we can just drop that into columns, and then we can drop count sales into the rows, and we can make the size a little bit bigger to fill in the gaps. And we have the same histogram that we created automatically, that Tableau created automatically, right? Now they have more columns because their bins were smaller. And that brings us to a really important thing, and you don't necessarily have to do this with me, but I want to show you some things that we have to be concerned about when we are creating histograms. Now we've got kind of these two lumps, but we're not really quite sure if that's real or not. So something we might be able to do is to duplicate this field, my sales bin, and we're going to edit it. And now we're going to make this size of bins 25. And we'll just do 25 so we know what it is. We'll hit OK. We will make a new sheet, drop my sales bin 25, drop sales in here and count it, and make them bigger. Use the entire view just so we can see this a little bit better. We can see here that now we're starting to see kind of like a really good kind of peak here, and then maybe a little bit of that peak is showing here, and that maybe we'd have to dig a little bit deeper. Is this consumer sales? Is this corporate sales? We don't know. Now, unfortunately, we don't have that kind of data here, but this would be the kind of question you would be asking yourself as an analyst, which is, what is driving this shape to have two humps? There must be some other process going on. And so this is one of those situations where we make a visualization, it spurs new questions, which make us have to go get new data, and then we visualize again. Now, let's just keep going. Let's make a bin that's a little bit bigger. So I'm copying my sales bin 25, and I'm editing, and I'm going to call this one 100. Okay, I'll make one more. Dropping my columns in, dropping my sales in, changing it to count, making the size bigger, and not quite that big, and entire view. Now we think we can see here that this might have become over smoothed, right? We may be losing a little bit of our information about our data. And let's make a dashboard real quick, and I'll throw the last three that we just did on, the 25, the 50, the 50 was the first one, 25, and now this 100, and let's make this bigger. And we see here that, we have kind of a little bit different stories in each one of these histograms, and one of them is not right or wrong, but we want to be concerned, or we want to be careful about not removing too much information by binning too large. But we also want to make sure that we're not creating shapes that aren't really there by binning too small. Now, I'm not saying that we've done this, that we've underbinned this at all. I'm just saying that when you're creating the story, this is one of those moments where visualization is just as much art as science, and you as the storyteller have to decide which of these graphs is most appropriate for what the data says and what the story is that you're trying to tell. Now, the first question, if I'm management and you bring me this picture, is going to be, what's that other bump? Why is there a bump here and a bump there? And hopefully by that point you would have gotten the data to identify that, which they don't have in this particular data source. Right? So that's a histogram. It's pretty straightforward to create manually. It's really straightforward to create automatically, but don't just take the default bin size that Tableau gives you. Make sure you are using a relevant or a reasonable bin size for your context and your story. Now we're going to switch to looking at box and whisker charts, box and whisker plots. I've opened up the sample Superstore data and I've created a new sheet. And let's say we were interested in understanding the distribution of sales of categories of product or something like that, right? So we could basically do something like this. Now, if we go over to show me, it says we need one or more dimensions, 0 more dimensions, and one or more measures. And it has to use at least one dimension or disaggregate. So let's figure this out. So you either have to disaggregate with only using one measure, or you have to use a dimension. That's what this is basically saying. Now, what does that mean? Now, what it means is, if I just clicked on sales, you'll notice that box and whisker plot is not selected because the box and whisker plot is actually categorizing data and then seeing how it distributes, right? So if I if I control click or I command click on the Mac on, let's say, segment, now it lights up because now I'm doing sales by segment, and I'm going to look at the distribution of the sales by segment. And if I hit this, I get a box and whisker that has consumer here, corporate here, and home office here. Now, this is interesting, but it's not exactly compelling in that it's just 3 blue dots behind a box and a whisker plot, right? It's not especially easy to kind of make sense of this. Now, maybe what we really wanted to know was maybe the category in the segment, and we could put the segment in the color, and we could turn the detail into the category and get rid of the segment from the detail. And now we see we have a lot more dots. We get rid of show me. We see that we have consumers, which are the different categories are blue. We've got home office, the different ones are red. And we see that for these sales, they're distributed like this. Well, more interesting now because there's more dots. But maybe I want to see this over time. And you'll see now that if I just take my order date, I'll see a different, and I drag that into columns. Now I'm seeing that distribution for each year. And that's interesting, but maybe month is better. Let's see how my sales look like as they cycle through here. Now, I've got May, and this is all my Mays, right? This is not my year, each of my individual Mays. I've got just every May is aggregated together. Every May for technology is together. Every May for furniture is together. Every May for technology for home office is together, etc. Right? So they're all aggregated up to these levels, right? To segment and category. And we see here that we kind of have this, and this is typical in sales especially in corporate things, that January and February are the lowest. The end of the year is the highest. Why is that? People want to spend their budget before the end of the year, or else they get it cut the next year. And so that's when they say, okay, I've got enough money. Let's buy that furniture. Let's buy that new computer, etc. So we tend to see a trend that starts the year low and moves to the end of the year higher, right? But what's interesting is that we see that in most cases, except October, which is a little weird, these distributions at the end of the year are much wider than the distributions at the beginning of the year. And if we look here, this is consumer furniture, technology. This is all the consumer stuff is higher at the end of the year. Now, maybe that's because of Christmas. But we also see that, like, the technology for home office, the technology for, let's find one that's for corporate. Let's just look at corporate. See that corporate, follows that path that we would expect. End of the first quarter, we know where we're standing, we can start spending, and then we kind of loop it up to the end of the year. Very typical kind of sales curve that we might see. End of quarters being very important, both to the sales companies and the buying companies. All right, so this is basically just a box and whisker plot. It shows us something very different than a histogram. It shows us by category the distribution of particular metrics. So we could do some of sales. If we wanted to maybe compare that, we could potentially do profit as a second one. Now this is kind of hard to compare. We wouldn't typically want to do this to our viewers because we're asking them to compare up here. Shoot, I made a mistake. Maybe I would make my profit one squares, and we see here that is pretty much not a big difference, although it does seem just from this that the profitability of consumers is a little higher than the other ones, but can't tell that for sure from this graph. All right, wouldn't typically do this. I was just doing this to kind of show the ability to break this down in two. Now, where are these things coming from? Where are these distributions, the boxes coming from? Well, I'm so glad you asked. What Tableau has done is added a particular reference line. If I hit edit reference line, we see that we've created a box plot. Now there's a couple of options. The typical one that you would use is data within 1.5 times the interquartile range. And you can say which style do you want. You can use the classic, which is kind of, the modern one looks like this. Oops, sorry. You have just different choices, right, for this and how it looks. I prefer the modern one. There's fewer lines, which means less non-data ink. All right. Now we'll do a whole thing on reference lines. You've already done it in some things, but we'll do a whole thing on reference lines in another video. All right. So this is just a simple video on a couple of the key distribution graphs that we will use. They're for very different reasons to use each one, and it's easier to communicate more data in this box plot than you can in the histogram, but it's a different kind of communication is what's going on.